stop there, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Jerry, can you say more about the distinction between echo parents versus endo parents?
A boundary between the organism and the world.
So the echo parents means the context?
The ecology, or echo means home. The Greek word, I believe it's a Greek origin, and echo is the basis of the word economy, okay? But it really stands for the notion of home. So it's where the organism lives in.
Endo.
Endo, is that going inside? Is that what's going on inside the object or the identity? The identity of what you're dealing with. So there's a crisp and well-documented, well-defined separation of meaning between the object you're referring to and the environment in which it exists. Now, I should point out what there's a distinction here between what Larry pointed out with his view of cybernetics as being outside. This is not, no, the natural science perspective is not at that level of description. I'm concerned about reproducible results that can be pragmatically useful in the real world of treating patients. And this comes out, and I would say that this comes out of my own professional experience in dealing with the dose-response relationships between individual chemical structures, synzymes in Peirce's terms, and patients in the clinic, and what these dose-response relationships and how they are interpreted with regard to their utility for the public health.
Lloyd raised the hand.
Yes,
Yes.
Jerry.
I think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lloyd.
Thanks, Jerry. It is always nice to listen to you. Although I have a problem that you don't reach out, you make statements and throw them to us. And let me say, if I understand it differently, that is based on Cooper Langford's work and also Maturana. And also there's a book, in my opinion, important, which is Mason's Chemical Evolution. And these sources, in one way or another, have learned, at least I have begun to see that way, that we have different types of systems, chemical systems and physical systems and biological systems. And I all the time feel that you want an accolade over that. And that accolade, that is the relation to mathematics, in my opinion, or logic, or a formal system, which in my opinion would serve only to go from one system, one substantial system, to another, building a hypothesis from one domain, and the mathematical expressions or the logical expressions then help us to come from one domain to another domain without necessarily having to integrate them. So I come back to the notion of AP, which I said in response to Maurice. It is not necessary to integrate everything, and it is not possible to do that, because these dimensions, for example, as soon as we take psychological or social systems, that becomes even more manifest. It may be in the natural sciences less manifest. These dimensions are more or less orthogonal, and there is no need to integrate them.
Let me respond to Lot's comment about don't need to integrate. What's important, what I think Jerry is saying, is you must understand the distinction, because your language changes, your logic changes, and the inability to communicate is transmitted because of the distinction between categories. So if I'm talking physics and I'm trying to deal with social systems, I will do violence to that system or vice versa. So this is the distinction.
But why would you not be allowed to do violence? Because you need to do violence because you have an hypothesis. You go into the systems.
My hypothesis, Lut, is that there is truth functions in natural sciences that are put together, are composed, and if you start with the physical notions, and you use simply the concept of additivity of parts of wholes, then you do come to a mathematical and logical conclusion that the human body has mass, that it has electrical properties. This is not just pie in the sky notion of separation of disciplines. This is based on found scientific evidence that the human body has mass and that it has electrical properties. And that from a molecular or from a natural science perspective, these property of mass and the property of electricity is that these are conservative properties by physical laws, Newton's law and Coulomb's law, which read to the composition of the whole. So that's the basic natural science argument that I am using to compose the parts of the whole by addition.
So the assumption is the body is the whole.
Oh, well, the body is whatever term you decide to select for it.
Thank you.
But what I find important is his first slide where he says non-Boolean. Because in Boolean structures, there is a truth function. There are truth tables. Anyone who has designed a circuit understands the truth function. It's very simplistic and or not, but etc. It's a conjunctive and disjunctive logic. It's powerful. We're working on that. What Jerry is contending is Boolean algebra, Boolean laws of thought, 1850s, is inadequate to understand nature in its complexity, in its entailment. And there are four propositions that I hear from him. Number one is it adds to the concept of feedback and feed forward. In feedback and feed forward, it's a darn arrow with Bateson and others. It's sort of a simplistic, we'll just feed in the data. What Jerry is saying, no, it is related to how I am pre-obligated, how I'm preformed to interact with that outside world, the echo and the endo, etc. So he adds something, I think, to feedback, feed forward, number one. Number two is he brings the concepts of wholeness out of parts versus parts creating wholes, which is the cybernetic of machines logic. So the ability to understand wholeness as a complete structure that interacts with parts, and the parts then interact with the whole, you're creating an ecology beyond me and my environment around me. Number three is his use of a dictionary, and that's what goes to when I was talking with Lot, is if you go between, I'm a cultural anthropologist, when I go between one culture and another, I had better stop my assumptions and logics as best I can to be able to hear, see, perceive what is there. What is important is he focuses on composition. And composition is what I heard from Maurice, is the ability to do work, the ability to get something done, to construct something. So if we're into this constructivist logic of observers and images, we do not yet have the ability to understand the logic of the observer, because in first order cybernetics of artifacts of our prostheses, thinking prostheses, they do not assume, they assume that there's not an observer. So the science that we are part of a paradigm, analytic reductive, is inadequate to go to deep nature. That's powerful.
Klaus? We cannot hear you. That
You want to
Have
mute?
to mute. Yeah. You have to
Want to go back and
unmute.
come back in?
No, it's okay. I'm just listening.
I think his microphone is not.
Your microphone's not working, Klaus.
Come back. Yeah, come back.
Come back in.
Come back.
You can try to put the volume up, might work, the volume on your mic.
Or in Windows, go to sound management.
System is not.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Now,
Okay.
good.
Okay. Let me start actually with several observations. One is actually Bernhard at some point started saying where the whole thing of our hierarchies come from, and that is Franz von Forster. And he is correct to say there is, like Lowell emphasized again, you know, the machine logic of the original cybernetics being there and outside without any observer. And then he came with the idea of that the observation is important. Now, the observation or the observer, and indeed, one doesn't have any machines without any description of it. But descriptions are just descriptions about things. Now, and I have to say that we have to, I'm a little uncertain with the word about. Larry used it about. But when you say about, then you always say there is something here and something outside. And that is the mistake. And this is the mistake of actually a theory of language or conception of language in which we are easily sucked into. And I think, for example, Hans von Förster calling this the emphasis on the observer or the maker or the describer as second order is inverting precisely the theory of logical types from Russell, the idea of representation, and that gets us easily on a bandwagon of first and second, third order, and etc., etc. It's a mistake. It's a mistake because it ignores. Now, I have to say also, when I say a mistake, I think Jerry is correct. The natural sciences don't care about what happens. They describe, and the word is outside, and there's nothing that one can do about it. One describes it the way it is, and biologists do the same thing. But I think from cybernetical point of view, in my opinion, it was actually Margaret Mead who at some point suggested this is that the cybernetics of machines, let me say, is not really enough. One has to look at the consequences of cybernetics, and one has to see the nature of the language that we're using to describe it. That means the consequences. And when you see of consequences, you arrive at a different notion of language. There's, for example, Wittgenstein's notion of language games, that language is not just description, it is something that you play, and in the course of interaction, you create things. There is the notion of Austin's speech act theory, which is performative. That means if you make a promise, there's no truth and falsity to it. It is actually the consequence of what you make after a promise, that you live up to it. So that is a different way of thinking, and I think one should not confuse those type of things. And to me, living in the social domain, and that's of course something natural scientists, I would say, almost ignore, that there are in fact social elements, that they have a discourse, that they create things. That's not part of the natural sciences. But I think we have to realize that we are living in society. When we develop a theory, this might be published and it might have consequences. And that is, for example, where Maurice comes in my opinion, that when we describe certain things, it may do things. It may be entering it. Now, then comes the issue of agent. Now, I have my own view of agents. I don't think agent is something a physical force that does things. An agent is someone, a human being, who makes certain things happen. But there's this kind of a subjectivist notion of agent. I mean, I'm in charge of myself. The other one is that one explains to others what one is doing. And I mentioned that in my talk on critical cybernetics, where the point is actually, it's not that someone acts, but rather than that someone explains the action and is accepted as such or not, and that makes certain things true. So I think when we talk about agent, we should talk about the social nature of the agency and not just the doing. So I think it's really dysfunctional to me to get too quickly into the first order, second order type of thing. We have to see just what is it that we are doing with our language, with our descriptions, how we influence the world, etc., etc. So I'm very much on Larry's camp to say, for example, we engage in conversations and not just descriptions. And the conversations, they change things all the time. And I think that is the type of thing in which I would like to see cybernetics located.
Can I respond to that, Klaus? In one particular aspect only, and this is with regard to the word aboutness.
Yeah.
What are we attempting to communicate when we use the word aboutness? Now, the distinction that I choose to make is that the aboutness is a semiotic indication that somewhere we have some signs or signals or events or processes or whatever that are outside our bodies, that which we then receive and interpret. Now, our choice of how we interpret this aboutness is one that we choose our descriptive language about. Now, what distinguishes the chemical sciences from the physical sciences and mathematics is that the chemical sciences are clearly and clearly bounded by the necessity of having an aboutness that refers to the chemical elements as identities. And it is that role of identity in the chemical sciences, in the chemical table of elements, that distinguishes the logic of chemical systems and indeed living systems from the logic of physics and the Boolean logic that I alluded to. So if you want to use the word aboutness, you have to communicate accurately, you have to, in some sense, decide whether that aboutness is something internal to my thinking about the world, or it is something that I am referencing to the external world. And this is a distinction between chemical aboutness, if you would, and physical or mental aboutness. And so the C.S. Peirce's work therefore gains its importance and consequently category theory from this constraint, this very deep and profound logical constraint that however I'm going to use the symbols, they have to be a semiotic source of the symbol.
Well, first of all, I mean, I agree to some extent. And yes, I'm using the word about also in everyday life when I talk about the weather and whatever. But the point is actually when we deal with cybernetics, we go beyond that. We change certain kind of things. Now you talk about chemistry. Chemistry is not just descriptive. It's not just understanding chemistry. It's doing things, inventing new kinds of combinations, etc., etc. So there is always an action involved. And this goes beyond the aboutness.
No,
and that's what I think we miss when we exclusively go to the logical structure of language, meta language, etc., etc. That's what Russell, in fact, completely misunderstood, in my opinion.
I agree that Russell completely misunderstood it.
Yeah. But by not being able to get into the dynamics that it sets in motion. And that's what Varela and others, pointed out, that these hierarchical structures,
Yeah.
they can be dissolved in time. Or what Larry points out always, that there are circularities that are inside and not from the outside.
Klaus, what I find remarkable about many of your arguments, not just today, but historically as this series unfolds, is that we are in full agreement on so many points. The distinction is that I decided on the basis of the sorts of arguments that you present, that there must be a different form of mathematics, that the mathematics and the logic of natural systems somehow must be very different from the Boolean logic or classical orthodox mathematics that distinguishes how we view the world.
I don't want to make categorical statements, but I think mathematics has always a very defined and clearly pointed direction, and that gets always in the direction of causality and not in innovation and deviating from it. So I'm skeptical in making mathematics the governing system of our thinking.
Okay, yes, I agree with you that classical or orthodox mathematics is stuck in that position. The distinction that I choose to, or the distinction that the chemists make, that the entire chemical sciences make, is that when you move from an atomic proposition to a molecular proposition, you create new information. Okay, you must create new information so that intrinsic to the composition of atoms into higher order structures, you are increasing the amount of information you create with every step of addition.
But
So there's the necessity to create information is intrinsic to the chemical sciences.
Yeah, for the observer or the scientific community.
No, for nature itself.
May I ask, is about the property of the model or of the thing which is being modeled?
Yeah, that's the question.
No, it's in my view, it's a question of the number or the number of numbers.
Jay, please.
Yeah. If I may, the point that Jerry is trying to make is that there is a view in mathematics, if you look historically or contemporarily, that clearly goes back to the 0 and the 1 of the Boolean logic. So that's there's only two choices, 0 and 1. And then there is another view in mathematics that this may be not as visible as it ought to be, and that actually goes back to the categorical logic of Aristotle, where it acknowledges containers without saying it has to be a 0 and a 1 in the beginning. And to make that more clear, it's a reference to electricity. Dus that some people thought, okay, there's only one way to think of electricity, and that's in terms of a 0 and a 1, and therefore Boolean logic is at the foundation of everything. While in reality, the presentation from Jerry, as I understand, is to point out there are actually multiple ways to think about electricity. It's not just a 0 and a 1, it's much more complicated. So we should not say that mathematics must be starting with a 0 and a 1. And that is what I think is going on.
Maurits, are you still there?
Klaus,
Yep.
You probably want to have some response.
No, I just had to answer the door, so I disappeared for a minute. So what do I need to respond to? Sorry.
Let me put a comment out there. Is people were very afraid with the concept of relativity. Things are just relative to one another. Cybernetics came in and said, it's not just relative, whatever. It's relational. It is the organization of structures, of components, etc. Not just like Legos, but as the trees outside my place here. And so the difference between relative and relational. So there's the whole science of organization of the context. And that's what Jerry is saying. It's that echo parent of the environment and the endo parent of the organism, that interrelationship creates in all organisms that are alive a representation, an image. And you do that through three ways, and that corresponds to the three orders, not higher orders. There are three orders of cybernetics. First order, of course, is the order of the silicon chip and cybernetics of artifacts without the observer. So you're basically including the image, the protocols, the time gates in that. When you start dealing with the observer, second level, second order, not level, order, you're dealing with something totally different, which is identity, agency, perception, that goes beyond just input and output. And what Jerry is saying, there's a third order of cybernetics, which is our understanding of nature is inadequate because, and I think Maurice said this, evolutionary economics, evolutionary design is far beyond those two first orders. And until humans start organizing their world and designing their institutions and their conversations by understanding the deeper levels of nature that Jerry and others are trying to get to, we will not have a cybernetics of system or living systems, however you want to define it.
George, Beer, you haven't said anything yet.
Oh, I love listening. Everybody's expressing thoughts that are quite valuable, so I just enjoy absorbing. I will mention, Maurice, I still haven't gotten back to you, but I still intend to. You sent me your paper. I plan to read it. I just checked out your book. It's a little pricey.
Yeah, no, goodness.
So if I get real excited in the paper, maybe I'll spring for the book.
Yeah, go to the library to your local library to buy it.
I think there's a lot of things that are very similar in what we're looking at anyway.
Just earlier comments about the relationship between, if you want, descriptive thinking and mathematics. In the book that's coming out, most of it is really constructive, building models and looking at relationships and explaining those relationships. And I found that the last chapter is actually a mathematical chapter. And there's a remarkable difference between that chapter and all the others. The mathematics enables you to get precise relationships between different attributes, however you define an attribute, that is not possible with broader descriptive processes. Most of the theories that I've generated are general theories that only start to be meaningful when you apply them, and to try and explore some complex situation, to try and dig out what relationships really mean and what their consequences are. But as soon as you set up a mathematics to relate to those descriptions, you can generate consequences that you would never have thought would actually appear. And that's what I've found. Anyway, thanks.
Could I respond to that, Maurice?
You create consequences, but they are mathematical consequences. They are not necessarily the consequences of the system that you're facing.
However, mathematical consequences aren't in isolation. If you're dealing with the real world and you're interpreting the mathematics, then the consequences that are mathematical can be interpreted in terms of the real world.
If it fits.
I think
it
at this
doesn't
point,
always fit, particularly not when you deal with social phenomena.
Here, I think the issue of what constitutes mathematics becomes crucial. How are the terms of mathematics related to anything to do with reality? Can there possibly be any strict mathematical logic that is internally consistent, relate to nature, without first defining what those terms mean in the other language? In other words, what are the constraints on mathematical language? How is mathematical language used either to find two functions or to lie like hell? The mathematics is used in so many ways and so ambiguously that you have great freedom within the logic of mathematics to draw a huge range of conclusions. And these are not obligatory conclusions from a practical sense. They're simply not obligatory. You might want to, and to avoid this, of course, the mathematicians use the notion of probability theory. And this probability theory then becomes a general weapon to defeat or to either to win an argument or defeat other arguments. And that's a contest between mathematicians and mathematical logic. It has very little to do with reality and the languages of reality. That's my philosophy of mathematics. And Jason, we might want to do something someday on the philosophy of mathematics.
Of course, of course. Just to
Because
save you.
it's so central to the philosophy of cybernetics.
With cybernetics of mathematics.
Or cybernetics of mathematics is an equally interesting topic.
Pierre, you want to say something?
Well, I got in late and I've been traveling for the last 2.5 months. So I've been missing some of the conversations. I did not hear Maurice's, but I am going to be responding or having some comments, I think the 16th of June. And so I'm not going to say anything about it here. I do think that there are many different points that Maurice is making in his presentation, and assuming it's going to be the similar one that I'm going to be addressing then I will. I have also started getting into the paper that you sent out that was just published in Systems. But I think some of what Maurice is talking about has to do with epistemology and what people talk about in terms of second order cybernetics, and some of it has to do with ontology. And I'm particularly interested in cybernetics as the art, science, study, practice of effective action and human cyberneticity. And so I'm probably going to respond on most of that. I thought Larry's piece was really clear, straightforward, easy to understand, accessible. And Larry and I have had a number of conversations over the years, and I think the issues that many second order cyberneticians are focusing on are really important in terms of epistemology, et cetera, and the role of the observer as part of the system. But I think there's a whole lot more to cybernetics than just epistemology and what is conveniently or typically known as second order cybernetics. So I thought Larry did a great job of laying some things out that would enable me to have a conversation about what Larry said. With Jerry's, I confess, and it's probably that I just don't have the requisite capabilities, but I didn't understand most of what you were saying. And I certainly didn't see anything in there about biocybernetics. I mean, it was referenced, but I didn't see anything about biocybernetics. And so, I mean, I've spent most of my career as a professor and as a practitioner, and both of those require effective communication, or you don't get paid. You don't get, you're not being able to stay in your job. And so I find a lot of these conversations stimulating, some confusing, some go completely over my head or outside my domain of cognition and communication. But if cyberneticians can't communicate with each other, then there's a good reason why we're not communicating real well with a lot of people who are non-cyberneticians. So I find this worth coming to. And again, the easiest one that I can have a conversation with, which I think would be really important, are these issues that Larry raised, much of which I agree with, some of which I don't quite agree with, or I interpret them slightly differently in terms of the language. And of course, was it Wittgenstein or Heinz that said the problem with language is language? It might have been somebody else, but you know, that notion, they're all imperfect ways of being able to communicate. What I really like about the general thrust, and I'll close with it for now, especially since I've sort of re-entered the cybernetics community. I was heavily involved 30, 40 years ago, and then I got involved in a variety of exo communities where I use cybernetics all the time. It's very good and very gratifying to get back in because it allows me to address some of the substantive issues. But in particular, Klaus and Larry have been really, really good at, you know, emphasizing the importance of communication in the social domain, where it's really crucial. And I think in both the science and the practice of it, in ways that I find easy to follow. Now, I've known both of them for a while, and so I'm familiar with some of the language and some of the terms. Some of it I don't know, but I found these discussions interesting and important, some aspects really important. And I'm looking forward to being able to throw in my 2 cents worth on the 16th, because I do think issues of effective action and agency are really, really critical, and the ability to communicate with not only ourselves, but if you take Larry's, and I'll close with this comment, I like having the diagram. I'm a visual person, so I think it's words, just diagrams and pictures don't help. Just words don't help. I like diagrams. I think one thing I would say is that I'm looking for ways to be able to have conversations, not just with the cyberneticians who are within the cybernetics part of the way of knowing, way of thinking, way of talking, whatever exactly you said, Larry, but also with other people who are engaged in other ways of knowing and I would say acting. And so this element of focus on communication, the social context, that it's not like machines. I think Klaus has made some really important points with respect to his work on critical cybernetics that I've seen in the last 3 or 4 months about underscoring sort of the mechanistic approach to cybernetics in the early years as it was taken over by people who were focusing on the mechanistic aspects, and we got away from the holistic and the conversational and the constructive aspects. Rocks don't talk to each other, at least not in any evidence that I've seen, but people do talk to each other, and they talk about people talking to each other, and people talk about rocks talking to each other when they write novels and other things. So therefore, this domain of conversation is really important. So I think it's really critical to be able to talk more clearly, and so we can act more effectively within ourselves, but also with those other people who aren't part of this community or don't understand cybernetics. And my comment would be, is I think cybernetics as part of one of the system sciences is the most significant science, not in a superior sense, as Larry is, I think, important to point out, but in a sense that it is meta, I would say meta, and it cuts across so many different fields and paradigms, but because the logic of science, or the science and practice of effective action, is what gives human beings the ability to construct all these different kinds of societies and worlds and knowledges and machines that is really important. So is that enough for now?
Quick transfer.